Thank you, Nikki. Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a great learning time in Teams Nation. And certainly it's a mouthful of a title, but I think it was important to have those keywords in there. And you might notice I didn't use Copilot in there at all. So hopefully, I think looking at the attendance there, I think good over 50 audience, and that's really good. So look, first of all, warm welcome, and for those of you who are here for the first time, even more welcome. Welcome to you. It's my sixth time at the Teams Nation, and I just want to say big thanks to Chris, Vasco, and other team members, also the moderators. So we all give up our own time to basically deliver as best as we can. So my topics around the Teams side of things, but we all use the apps and services in Microsoft 365, depending on what our style of working is. And you probably saw some sessions earlier today from Daryl and Sari, how people can use their experiences around managing files, content, conversations, and where various folds. So document management really plays a big part on that. So what we're going to be looking at is certainly things like some of the experiences you can interact with Teams. So we'll use predominantly a lot of it in Teams, but given or not, it still uses SharePoint under the hood. And there are obviously over the years various types of audiences. People work with these technologies. Some prefer to stay in SharePoint, work with the files, or some prefer to just work with Teams, especially all the new organizations over the pandemic who's joined, they may not fully appreciate that the SharePoint has things on offer. So we'll look at that in this session so that you can take away some of the things that you didn't know that you could do that, so that you could go back to your organizations, think about it, maybe plan it, maybe even review your existing SharePoints as to how things are hanging together. So hopefully you'll be able to take away some of those tips as well. And when we talk about document management, and certainly, what Nikki just briefly mentioned, we're all kind of making sure that, our content, files, sites, you name everything, right? We want to make sure that it's at least organized in a particular way that obviously works more appropriately for your user groups. But also at the same time, making sure that Copilot is also being able to use more efficiently, because nothing worse than just having a dumping ground of your files, not taking seriously with your permissions, and then Copilot comes along, which will just give you exactly what you've put in your SharePoint environment. So obviously Copilot will respect that security and privacy, but at the end of the day, it's down to you how you manage your files and who's got access to it, and so forth. So I'll probably share just a slide or so at the end as some of the things that has an impact on the document management side of things. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Chirag Patel. I live and work in London. I've been sort of working with Microsoft 365 for almost 10 years, or formerly Office 365. Come from a SQL Server and SharePoint background. So really kind of my first hands-on VPOS migration, if you like, was sometime in 2012, which was a great experience, taking the SharePoint from back then Portal Server 2003. So loving it all the time, every day I still learn more about, all things in Microsoft 365. I also worked with, as a trainer, so I deliver Microsoft Viva, SharePoint, as well as Purview compliance courses as well. So some of my recent projects include migrations through the divestments of companies, separating, and also the merger of the companies. So that's the last couple of years been kind of busy around that, but also helping design and implement some of the retention management, records management, compliance policies for a public sector organization. So really kind of a mixed bag. I kind of enjoy working in various capacity, both as an architect, as hands-on engineer, or simply just doing reviews of the Microsoft 365 environments, writing out remediation plans, and sometimes I end up fixing those as well. So really, I see all kinds of implementations there. And if I have some time, I like to speak and share, as well as I run and organize Microsoft 365 UK user group as well. So techchirag.com is the best way to get hold of me, and you'll find all the links from there onto social media and elsewhere in the conferences that I speak at. Okay, so enough about me. Very briefly, for those of you who don't really work with SharePoint in a great deal or sense, it really is a kind of, if you like, the strongest content management system that you have. And we're not talking about just the intranet, although you can do that as one of the services you offer, but also we look at things like, the general overview around how you go about managing your files, whether that's through your daily Teams collaboration, or whether that's your projects that you're working with, or perhaps maybe somebody has thought of an idea or some initiative who may have kind of used Teams, group chats, and so forth. And then eventually you may end up creating a Teams chat space to take that initiative forward, perhaps becoming something of a bigger team landscape. So still it will use SharePoint in the background. But really, when somebody tells me what can SharePoint do, this is the slide I always show them. It's only 5 things pretty much you can do with it. Files is predominantly the large part of it, but yes, you can do clever things with pages and all the customizations and building your rich user experiences. And there are various examples out there in the community, as well as some of the lookbook.microsoft, I think it's microsoft.com. I've got the links at the end, in which you can gain a various amount of ideas to design your sites in that way. So when we look at document management side of things, why would we bother even doing it? And this is something, over the years, likes of Gartner, Forrester, everybody, kind of have provided various kind of stats, reports, and, take it or leave it, you might fall in one of these areas, right? Whether you are going to migrate onto Microsoft 365 from your current file share, even though I do see a lot of organizations use SharePoint and still they have a file share that's still being used. So you're still using some of the organizations in various ways. You might want to migrate from another systems, right? It doesn't matter, whatever it is, right? Even if you're using Teams, you're still going to be using SharePoint in the background. You might be in a situation where you have to have a formal classification of your systems around how you manage your files. Certainly public sector organizations, they have to work towards some kind of an information framework in which they're being advised where to file their files, in which kind of areas of SharePoint sites, what kind of retention policies they should be adhering to. So all those things comes very much useful in the space of document management. When you look at it from a collaboration point of view, just before we go into the demos and everything else, it is worth realizing that obviously when you do, when you go to the kind of the usage of collaboration side of things, it's very easy to create your team chat spaces, your sites, or if you're in OneDrive, you can create your shared libraries. All those things will create the SharePoint sites. But then, why wouldn't you? Because you've got a capacity of around 2 million of those. So, you could practically create as many teams or their SharePoint sites, as many as you want, because that's kind of sufficient capacity, depending on your size of your organization, what kind of work you do. You may want to think about in the long term, how many sites you might end up creating. If you look at from on the other end, I've seen organizations where practically they've just got one SharePoint site, with literally a lot of employees, and they've organized everything by folders, and everybody pretty much can see everything, but they spend more time on the permissions side of things. And I think some of you might be already familiar with, if you have a full-time job looking after SharePoint, a big percentage of that will be that you might look after permissions, inheriting and making unique permissions and all those things. And that's okay, but it kind of after day 7 or day 180, that management of systems becomes very overheaded, and you see a lot of pain in managing SharePoint. So definitely you need to think about how you plan and how you kind of go about organizing your SharePoint sites. And there is obviously, you use information architecture. Again, there's a lot of literature out there, a lot of advices from Microsoft and good practices about how to think about your users, being able to find, search the various information in your SharePoint, as well as being able to at least keep up to date and not forget about it, because as organization moves on, things change. You want that kind of flexibility to be able to switch things around as and when you need. Okay, so we look at from a practical point of view. The next few slides, they're just purely for information purposes, but I'll kind of run through the demo side of things. So, the slides will be just for the reference there. And I think key parts to address here is that when you do create your, whether you call it a bucket, space, SharePoint site, there is some kind of a theme or topic that you do. And, these are just some of the ways you can create a SharePoint site depending on, how you work with M365. If you're really kind of an email savvy type person, you might end up creating groups, if you like, within Outlook, right? Or if you're within SharePoint and if your organization haven't disabled the ability to create SharePoint, then you will be able to create that within SharePoint. I'm a kind of firm believer about this, that if organizations really lock things down, that only IT or some kind of a governance group can create these sites, then they really need to keep an eye on your content, because this is one area which things constantly change, unlike your structured systems you may have, such as finance or HR, where things are really prescriptive and you're able to manage more effectively. So here I always believe you should give the power in the hands of the user, but still have some kind of a governance eye keeper to see if things have been created. Then you have a right to question, to say, how is it going, why you've created that site, or I see you've created one after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then being able to at least ask them, if they're able to, go and work with another SharePoint site or another team of groups, or maybe simply say, you know what, you don't need that, or you need to do something else. Creates that kind of dialogue, if you like, with the organizations, as opposed to we forget about SharePoint site once they've been created, and then, like it or not, they end up staying there forever, right? Unless they've been, applied with a policy of retention, then those sites will exist forever, and therefore your search and everything else gets cluttered with the amount of data you have. So what I wanted to show you is the Teams side of things, and a couple of ways to think about this is typically when you do go into Teams, I'm just going to use the web so I don't make sure I don't get terminated with this session. But if I go into Teams, and this is the Contoso Electronics demo environment I'm using, which I'm sure some of you have seen this already and familiar with it. So if I go into my Teams area, I've got kind of a set number of Teams chat spaces going on there. So there's some with private channels, such as managers inside the retail. But as a user, if you want to create a new team, you can just simply go in there like you do here and create a team, and you get few options there, right? Most of the time, the default is private, or unless if your organization has put a sensitivity label on it, then you may see some options restricted, right? So here I've got private option, or I can choose as public or org-wide. And I think that's just a basic experience. When you create a team, you will get a SharePoint site behind the scenes. But I don't get any other options there if I wanted to use things like templates or anything like that for be able to store and manage my files accordingly, right? Now for that, I have to go somewhere else for it. So before I do that, what I also want to show you is that if I then go to Microsoft 365 groups sort of things, which again, some of you might be familiar, which is the underlying base for a lot of these services that run in Teams and groups and Exchange and so forth, then in my inbox through on the web version of it, I can see there are some various groups. So each of these groups correspond to those teams that are in Teams chat spaces. But the different thing here is that if I do create a new group, and this might be the scenario where you don't really want to do things with Teams, but you want to keep things very much in an email-based oriented and being still able to manage your files, still allow external collaboration to happen, but kind of cutting the chats out. So this is one way of doing it. And when you do create this new group, it will also create that corresponding SharePoint site with it as well. So just so you're familiar with, because I've seen examples where, organizations have got a number of duplicates or things have been renamed slightly differently. And sometimes the SharePoint sites exist, but only for chats, and the actual content area is still empty. So you want to probably have a look at that in terms of what your groups look like, as well as your SharePoint team sites. So when you do create your groups, obviously then when you go back to your teams, then in there, when you do create the actual teams side of things, you'll be able to see where you can actually create the actual teams from the actual existing group itself. So that's another experience there. Instead of creating, if you click on join your team, and when you click on create a new team, then you get a lot of the options. Again, it's very simple for me to say this, that when you create a team, do this and do that. But the end user experience, if they're allowed to create teams, they sometimes skip this part completely. So here you can see that if I go specifically with the group side of things, and if I've created any other groups, or if I created from Outlook, I would see all my options appearing here. So I can attach my existing Teams chat space that I would create from here to an existing group. And that's quite important, because when we see a bit later on, when we have to apply the retention, because obviously sometimes you want to retire these things, it becomes a lot more easier to apply policies to the entire site or the group itself instead of the individual folders side of things. So I thought I'll just quickly mention that. So that experience is kind of there. So whether you create or join the team. Okay. Now, again, some of you may already know, but if you don't, if you create a channel inside the Teams, most of the time we end up creating the standard channel teams there, right? So if I go and create my sorry, wrong place. If I go and add a channel, we all know we get few options, and if you've enabled your tenant to have external collaboration through your Teams and Azure B2B, you may be able to create shared Teams channel. But either of it, when you do create one of those channels, then behind the scenes, it also creates a SharePoint site, which is purely for the management of these files. And I wouldn't really recommend customizing those private channel SharePoint sites. So once you do that, you have all the types of content. So for various reasons of your document management in terms of where your files, everything else resides. And you can obviously go to SharePoint Admin Center every period, now and then, ask your administrator to give you a list of all the SharePoint sites. It's a simple export button they get from the administration console, and you can review your SharePoint sites together with your other team, whoever looking after your entire document management capabilities side of things. Yeah. Keeping an eye on the chat as well. So if there's any questions, please feel free to ask them or stop me at any point. But once you've kind of gone through your site side of things, then we obviously want to then think about in the actual the site itself. So within here, if I go to my general channel, for example, usual things, you got your files, any tabs you may add, and any files that you might modify, everything else, you can go into your, maybe that's the wrong one, go to monthly reports and go into files. Then all these are your folders inside your SharePoint documents, document library. Now, from a document management perspective, that might not be a good thing, because if all your files, folders, your channels related files, everything stays in a single document library. So if you want to then apply policies for managing your documents lifecycle, it can become a bit difficult, especially if you've got mixed content going on inside your SharePoint document library. But again, it's something to bear in mind when you do plan your document libraries in there. And obviously by that, I can still bring additional document libraries through the use of tabs or everything else. One thing I do want to touch on is the folder side of things. So if I look at the folders, and I'll just head over to another team, go to my design folder, design channel, sorry. I'll just go and create another folder. And yes, for some of us, this is quite a good thing. You know, we can choose colors. So we might just say, create this folder in here called guidelines, which is only going to go and create a subfolder, if you like, inside your, in this particular case, the design channel. And the design channel is still a folder in there. And that's great, right? Now, from a shortcut point of view, and we'll have a look at the SharePoint side of things in a minute, but when you do create folders and files in here, and a lot of you, including myself, love OneDrive because it's easy to get to my files and everything else all inside my OneDrive. So there's a couple of the differences you get in here. Firstly, if you was to use guidelines folder in here, and if instead of having to come here every time, yes, we can use shortcut to OneDrive, and it will go and put a shortcut, or if I'm synchronizing my files to my machine, it will bring the shortcut down as well in my desktop environment. And in this case, it's just going to put that stub inside my OneDrive. But if it's a particular file that you want to share, and again, we want to prevent duplication or copying of files in another SharePoint or Teams chat space, then we can create shortcut here for a file, but we can choose where exactly we want to put that. Not necessarily in OneDrive, which is my files, but I could go ahead and say other locations, right? Again, it's quite good because I can now choose different SharePoint sites for that. So I'm in my Mark8 project team, design channel. I could go ahead and just say, maybe put that in sales and marketing. And within sales and marketing, I can go and put that in this particular folder there. So let's say product marketing, go ahead and select that folder. So same as that OneDrive shortcut, it will go and put this shortcut in the other file, in the other site as well. Yeah. So if I go into more product marketing, like so, in there, then in there, I'll find my shortcut that's been put in there somewhere if I can find it. Where is it gone? Maybe was that one or the wrong one? Okay, somewhere in there. I think hopefully you get it, but you can do that. So I'm not sure where I've put it. Maybe I've chosen the wrong folder there. Doesn't matter, but you can go back and forth and choose your files or folder to put where you want. Except the folder you go and put that in OneDrive. Okay. Since we're in here, from a document management perspective, again, if you've got tons of folders, tons of files, you can use views as well. So I won't go into great detail there, but you can create views based on particular types of files you might have, or maybe you might want to say, give me all the files that's filtered by a particular date, or if you've got any particular categories and so forth, then you can do all those things very easily. Yeah. Since we're in here, then the other thing we want to think about is you'll have your usual 3 default columns, the name of the files or folder, dates, modified, and so on. But you can go ahead and create additional attributes. And this is kind of important in a way, and it's been going on for a long time, that you can create metadata, pieces of information in which you can help to build search experience as well. So I did a search session sometime last year. It's still relevant, so feel free to look at my slides on customizing search experiences using the metadata. It's on my blog, chirag.com, and you can find the slides from there. But in addition to having the types of information you want to categorize, not necessarily for security or your compliance purposes, because that will be a separate metadata you'll have, but you can create some additional rich data in which you can possibly replace folders to an extent and use these views to be able to group them based on the columns that you may choose here. We can go a bit further with that. And for some of you who might be advanced in SharePoint management, might be familiar with content types. For those who probably use teams or files in a basic sort of way every day, you can go a lot more further by adding a content type in there. And content type simply is a type of document which you can have attached policies or attributes there, feed the actual templates. So it could be things like a sales contract or purchasing order or any kind of template you might use to deliver documents in that sense. So you could go ahead and click, say for example, add content types in there, click next, and only if your organizations have made it available. So as part of your overall document management, you might have a group of folks who might be looking after some of these areas of building blocks in which you can create. So this is something I created prior to that, and I'll just quickly after this kind of go through and to see where that's been stored. But I can choose based on what's available and go ahead and say apply sales contract. And then if I go and do that, it's going to add that one content type. And usually when you create your documents, you might either create a copy from an existing document, or in this case, I've got my sales contract drop down appearing there. So I can happily just go ahead and create my document based on that particular sales contract template, in which then I can go ahead and do things with it. Okay, so if I just quickly, if I want to change it, I'll just maybe choose this particular document there. And if I open up my information pane there quickly, then I can see there's not much in there other than just the name, title. I'll come to the label in a second, but there's no other attributes I can actually enter in there. But if I was to change this document to a sales contract, because I already just added just now, I can go and say, change that to sales contract type of document. And in that sense, what it then does is opens up a few other requested type of information. So here I can say this particular contract document is for a customer called something like Adventure Works. So this is where my taxonomy or my metadata is stored. So nobody can change that unless I allow it to do that from an administration point of view. And likewise, I can do the same for the salesperson. So that way, once I feed all this information, I can then go and create my views accordingly that I want to be able to sort, filter in that sort of manner. That's pretty much, if you like, the heart of it in terms of the building blocks of when you think about document management, metadata sort of things, the content types, organizing the groups of sites in variety of ways that you may want to be able to think to bring this together. Again, the good thing is to start small. Projects tends to be a very good example of it, unless you use some kind of a third-party project management tool in which some PMOs, I have seen they use single SharePoint site and the folders and bringing all their documents in a single SharePoint site. When I show them this, how you can manage, they all get dazzled and say, well, why don't we create separate project sites? Partly that's because they've not been educated or not trained, or adoption is just very low in terms of how to get the best value out of your SharePoint and investments in there. So because I'm here, so we'll kind of just shift the gears and go into the compliance management side of things. So it's all great. We got our files located, and permissions wise, we can share to whoever we want and do all those good things. But if I've turned on the retention management side of things, then I can choose my labels. Again, there are obviously better usable ways of doing it, but because I'm selecting the file there, then I could go ahead and choose my retention labels. And this is kind of important because it's almost an accident waiting to happen, that if all your files are just stored there permanently, and I know a lot of organizations, especially in the public sector, either they do it explicitly or it gets forgotten about the type of content they have. So again, you want to think about to put these labels if you haven't already, and this really is the key. And I know a lot of the organizations over the last 5-7 years who's kind of migrated into SharePoint Online here. I've seen projects where the first phase tends to be, let's just get files onto M365, start using Teams and so on. And then phase 2, we'll think about compliance, security. Well, you can argue, which comes first, or if you design it by secure, right? So anyways, you got your labels, that's great. But as a SharePoint person, if you're looking after information side of things, you do want to have a sneak peek, at least around how SharePoint compliance side of things work against all the other services you have. So if I go over to first I'll go to the SharePoint Admin Center. Just want to show you where those taxonomy term store is. So instead of going to the admin app, I'm just going to go direct to it and go to admin SharePoint. admin.microsoft.com/SharePoint. Again, SharePoint administrator will be kind of familiar with this, but I normally argue with a lot of organizations. I in fact empower sometimes the information governance group to request this kind of information on a regular basis. So your admin will have that. They might not do a lot with it, but you as an owner, you can actually ask them, go and export me a number of all these SharePoint sites so I can see what kind of content is moving in my organization. With regards to the metadata content type, that lives inside here, content services area of SharePoint admin. You could create some of these things in your own SharePoint site if you're a site owner, which means things will be only available to that SharePoint site. But if you want to make it to the entire company, you want to come over here. So you want to go into term store. You can put term group ownership as well. So as a business user, you can own and manage all those things that I showed you in that drop downs around how to manage your kind of customers, if you like, if you decide to use metadata in this way. Likewise, content type gallery, it's the same sort of thing. So you can create your content types. These are all the system ones. Wouldn't really recommend changing any of those, but you can use them to build onto your other content types in there. So in there, I got, I think I have my sales contract in there. So that's where I created my sales contract content type. And you can feed all those columns like you see here, customer, salesperson, and so on. And then you can simply publish. Or in some cases, you might want to withdraw that as well. So you might want to unpublish. So you can manage that very nicely in this area. Looking at time, got about 10 minutes, so nearly there. But the last part I wanted to show you was the compliance aspect of it. So those labels you saw there, and I appreciate some of you may not even have access to this. So if I go to my Purview compliance, and Purview is a set of services for compliance management, not just unique to Microsoft 365, but also exists in Azure as well. So here you got a whole raft of compliance services. That's a session on its own, and there's very good works out there, and I think especially Nikki, who's moderating this session, has done a lot of work, and in fact that's her forte to an extent, so definitely check that out. But for the purposes of SharePoint, and whilst we can go into other services in there, but specifically I want to touch on the data lifecycle management. So when you do design your SharePoint sites, and this is where you will see how powerful it is, because instead of giving users the options to pick and choose labels at a library level of files and everything else, and yes, you could make those defaults, which is great. But if you really think about your SharePoint site structure, including your hub sites, and you can group your sites accordingly to that hub and everything else, all that comes into very good play here. So always want to recommend that you try and use retention policies where possible. So this is like your container site level, right? If you do create labels and label policies, then you're talking about things like document library, folders, the actual files themselves, right? So vast majority of that, you'll have more flexibility there. But in this case, if I was to go and create my retention policy, and I've got a few there already, which those labels you saw earlier that became available was from label policies, but I can still create a container level there. So if I was to create one here, I'm not going to publish it, so I can call what I like. We'll skip that, but if you've got like a multi-units department, you want to kind of devolve the responsibility to the admins, then you can do that. A couple of things to note there is when you do create your policies for compliance, you don't want to come here every time, make a change and so on, but you want to use things like adaptive scopes. And specifically, you can see there in the description, it talks about the site URLs. So again, your naming convention really helps here. And suddenly, if you wanted to, let's say you've got department sites beginning with DEP, if you use that naming convention, you can easily then target all those SharePoint sites and the files inside them to apply this particular policy and say, perhaps maybe only keep them for 7 years, right? Or something like that. Here, I don't really get options because in a sense that, I can choose, but again, I'm not going to go into great detail there, but you can see the amount of options you got. You got SharePoint sites in there, including team sites, to be able to go with that and apply this particular policy. Where did I go wrong? Sorry, should have just picked static, beg your pardon. So if I go into my static scopes, I'm going to explicitly choose which sites to be able to choose. You can see here for the old classic sites, again, you probably don't want to use that, but that's not where your team sites will reside, but you might want to choose your groups there or sites. So these are a mixture of your Microsoft 365 group, which I was trying to create from Outlook earlier, or if I created my team's chat space or from an existing group, all that comes into this here. So this becomes a lot more easier, including private channel SharePoint sites as well, right? So you can then manage which sites to target to be able to at least look after your document management lifecycle for these sites. Once you kind of choose, and we put a couple there, and then we can just click done, next, and then you can choose your retention policy, whether you want to retain for 7 years or more, or maybe put your own duration there. What do you want to do files with them, delete, do nothing, and so on. So kind of really just wanted to touch on that briefly as to how you can then use these things very interchangeably. Again, there are various roles for these sort of things, but it helps that if you're in charge of looking after files for your organization, even if it's for your team, you would want to know if you're going to be liable for the policies around this. And if you see something that's very private sensitive, you want to feed that back to your administrator or your information governance group or whatever it's called to be able to help you manage this part of the process. Okay, all right, so back to slides. That was very fast tour of all the demos and everything else, and I could go on more, and I certainly run workshops, even with likes of my other colleagues, Kevin and Leon, and they've had their sessions today on this. So far, we've only talked about what's available in your services for your E3 or E5, whichever license you're using, in terms of accessing your SharePoint functionality, and it doesn't really stop there, right? So kind of just going to quickly go through some of the slides, and I kind of talked about it. When you do create a site, you can create all these things very quickly and easily to to your liking, and then still be able to integrate with Planner, Group, and Loop, that Daryl session you might have seen earlier, which was brilliant around how we can bring some of these things together. So we can do all that, and to our heart's content, be able to still store, manage. For some of you, if you want to see a reference where things are stored for SharePoint, OneDrive, you'll find all this useful, and there's links for these things as well at the end. You can try and look exactly where things are residing. Documents flow, just a guideline, really. If you want to start with OneDrive, great. Keep it private. It is by default, but obviously things move on. Then you want to try and bring that into SharePoint, and then be able to promote your team collaboration in that manner. We looked at the SharePoint sites and kind of briefly how do you bring them together, whether it's Teams, SharePoint, doesn't matter. You can, kind of, if you like, bring all those sites together and create a hub for it. And these are just some of the examples from Microsoft side of things, how you can choose and pick which sites you want to be able to build, bring and group them accordingly. And you can move them around as you wish as business changes. So your document management is still alive and kicking with the information that's relevant as and when you need it based on those permissions. Looked at some of those things. Obviously, I showed you just a brief examples of metadata, content type. There is things like document sets, special content types, if you like, special folders, in my view, in how you can bundle all the documents together and be able to use web parts on pages to be able to still highlight some of the content. And that could be also maybe with the content types or the customer metadata that we saw to be able to showcase just the files that's relevant to the user and so on. Okay, so a couple of slides. I'm just going to skip through those. Retention and deletion we looked at very briefly, but also sensitivity labels. You want to be able to classify and protect those files. DLP policies as well. So being able to prevent accessing highly confidential files through external sharing. So again, the links there, but that's still all very much part of your document management side of things. Okay. Last but not least, significant amount of innovations happening. Lots been talked about. SharePoint Premium, or it was Syntax before, and then Microsoft Syntax. The name changing ceremony just goes on. Because nothing is everything by design, right? So things will happen, but there are premium services, and now is a good time to invest if you haven't already. Again, very negligible amount to there. I don't get paid by Microsoft at all. But when I look at the amount of resource when people get hired to do certain types of jobs, in looking after your information, then you really want to think about advanced management of the SharePoint. So that includes not just the Microsoft syntax, but also some of the capabilities you now get to maintain your site lifecycle policies, applying some specific groups of Entron ID to restrict access to your sites, including picking up reports around inactive SharePoint sites. So you can do all those things. Have a look. My good friend Leon Armstrong, SharePoint syntax king, if you like, does all things around that, as well as migrations, everything else. Have a look at that, how we can bring that. And we've also run workshops before, Kevin McDonald, myself, and Leon, of course, around the Viva topics, as well as the syntax and everything. So have a look at that. And these are some of the resources. Hopefully you found the session there useful, and again, there's probably a lot more links than that, but I think this will be a good starter to start thinking about how strong your document management is. So hopefully you found this session quite useful, and some of the demos in there, and like ever, feel free to reach out to me, and I really wish you well for the Teams Nation, and any feedback will help. With that, I just want to say thanks to Nikki for moderating this session, and yeah, have a good day.